I'm Karl, one of the pastors here. If you would grab the program, and on the back of the program, you're going to find a bunch of fill-in-the-blank stuff. Some of you really like filling in the blank. It makes you happy to fill in the blanks, so you're welcome. Some of you don't. If you don't fill them in, that's fine. We are in our second week of a sermon series called All In. We're reading through the letter that a guy named Paul wrote to a bunch of Christians in the city of Rome. And we're going to be today in chapter 12, verse 1. If you've got one of these red Bibles in the seat in front of you, it is page 1035. If you have your own Bible, I don't know what page number it's on, but it's about right here on the right. Romans 12, verse 1. We're only going to make it through one verse today. I tried to make it through more verses than one, but I just couldn't get past verse 1. And just to let you know, I apologize because Steve talked about verse 1 last week, and actually Steve's going to talk about it again next week. So 3 weeks of verse 1. But it's just that important. It's just everything for the rest of the chapter. We got to get verse 1 right. Wow, I got stuff falling out. So Romans 12, verse 1, it says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is true worship." In order to get our heads into what I think Paul is trying to do with the Roman Christians, I want to tell you a story. So I got the privilege, I got the joy, the fun, and I know you're all going to think that what I say, you're all going to be like, yeah, Karl, that sounds fun. I got the joy of running overnight for 26 miles with a friend of mine who was doing the even more insane thing of running in his first 100-mile race. So my buddy Jeff Krause, Brian Haytack, and I, three friends. Jeff and Brian are both teachers at Arapahoe High School. The three of us run together a lot. And Jeff calls Brian and I one day. He's like, "Hey, I'm going to run a 100-mile race, and I want you guys to run with me." And of course, Brian and I were like, "Yeah, that sounds awesome." So the Leadville Trail 100-mile race just a few weeks ago. And here's how a 100-mile race works. The first 50 miles, you're on your own. You have to run on your own. You can stop and get water and food a few times, but you're not allowed to have anybody with you on the actual race course. But for the last 50 miles, you get to have a pacer with you. You get to have a friend or somebody that you dragged off the street, and they get to run with you in order to encourage you and support you along the way, because presumably at mile 75, you're thinking to yourself, whose stupid idea was this, and why don't I just quit now? So you have a friend there to say, no, you can do this. But the way it works is, on the way back, those last 50 miles, from mile 50 to mile 100, there's 3 aid stations that you can stop at. But at every aid station, there's a cutoff time that if you don't get there by the cutoff time, they pull you from the course. They say, you cannot continue because this is a run, this is not a crawl, and if you don't make it by this time, you're not going fast enough, they pull you from the course. Every year at Leadville, around 700 people start. Only about half of them are able to finish in the allotted time. And so there's the 3 cutoff times, plus at the finish line, if you don't make it to the finish line by 10 o'clock a.m. Sunday morning, 30 hours after the start, if you don't make it by 10 a.m., you're not a finisher. You don't get a medal. You get a pat on the back and a Kleenex because you're weeping because you just ran for 30 hours and you don't even get a medal for it. So our job is to get Jeff to the finish line. Well, he's coming into the first aid station after mile 50, and we're freaking out because the cutoff time is 10 p.m. And 9 p.m. rolls around, 9:15, 9:30, 9:45 rolls around, and no Jeff. He comes into the aid station at 9:48 p.m. We're only at mile 62 here, and he's got a 15-minute buffer now from the cutoff time. So all of us, his wife is there, his kids are there, Brian and Sarah Haytack are there, I'm up there, his cousin Brian is there. We're all freaking out because we're like, man, Jeff, you've still got over 40 miles left, and you've got a 15-minute buffer, so we're freaking out. Jeff and I head out of that aid station. We're going to the next aid station. We need to make it by 3 a.m. But Jeff gets some burst of energy at midnight or something, and he makes it to the next aid station at 2 a.m. He's got an hour buffer now. So we're all freaking out. We're like, oh yeah, you've got this. This is going to be amazing. We're going to go to the next aid station. We need to be at the next aid station by 6:30 in the morning. So we head out. Somewhere along the line, my watch dies, so I don't know exactly what time it is. And I think we're close to the aid station. Jeff's watch is also dead, and some guy shouts at us, "You're almost there, just 1 mile left, 15 minutes to go." We're like, 15 minutes? We've been averaging about an 18-minute mile pace. If we only have 15 minutes to go before the next aid station, sure enough, I reach in my pack and I pull out my phone. It's 6:15 in the morning. I need to get to the aid station with Jeff by 6:30 in the morning. So Jeff starts booking it. Now, granted, when you've just run 80 miles, booking it is a relative term. We get to the aid station, and Jeff's cousin, Brian, is there. And I keep pointing over here because Jeff's here. There we go, Jeff Krause. Hey, man. Jeff's cousin, Brian, just grabs him. He's like, "You don't have time to sit down. You don't have time to drink a cup of noodles. You don't have time to anything. We're going." Jeff rips his jacket and hat off and takes his headlamp off, and they just head out. So we all go to the finish line. I fall asleep, take a nap. I get up. We have till 10 a.m. to see Jeff across the finish line. I get up, it's 9 o'clock. I'm walking towards the finish line. And if you can picture, if you've been to downtown Leadville, cozy little mountain town, and about a half mile down Main Street, there's a few hundred people, maybe a couple thousand people. It felt like about 10,000, but I was delirious and sleep deprived, so who knows how many people were actually there. They're lining Main Street. So I'm a couple blocks away. I'm walking towards Main Street, and I can hear the announcer, and I hear the announcer call out somebody's name. It's not Jeff. It's somebody I don't know. I hear the announcer call out a runner's name, and something hits me. So I went to see Jeff run. But there's 700 other people who came to run, 350 others who are finishing. I don't know a single one of the other runners. And it makes me realize that most of the people lining Main Street probably only know one, maybe two runners who are running the race. Most of the runners coming across the finish line are complete strangers to all of the hundreds of people gathered there. And yet, and then the other thing is, at this point in the race, it's been 30 hours. All of the runners are completely spread out. They're coming in one at a time. So every runner is crossing the finish line. They're the only runner coming in. So most of the people in the crowd have no idea who this person is, right? So I'm walking up to the finish line, and I hear this name called over the loudspeaker, and then I feel the crowd just go absolutely wild, screaming and cheering for this complete stranger who's about to cross the finish line, and I immediately break down crying. I'm like, "Oh, it's just so beautiful," because they're cheering, and it's a stranger, and I don't know who that guy is, and that guy's been running for 29 hours, and I'm so happy that he's crossing the finish line. I compose myself. I find the rest of the crew, and we start to wait for Jeff. The finish time is 10 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, you're not a finisher. And 9 goes by, and 9:15 goes by, and 9:30 goes by. And we're freaking out now. We're going worst case scenario here. We're starting to cry again. But at somewhere around 9:35, Sarah Haytack, who's gone further down the road, climbed up over a little hill so she can see farther down the course, she texts, "I can see Brian," or "Who can I see? I can see Jeff at the bottom of the hill." And we all freak out, and we run down the street, and we're waiting at the bottom of the hill, and Jeff kind of comes up over the hill and comes down and meets us. And for the last half mile, anybody that wants to can come in and run with a runner in. So for this last half mile, Jeff and his wife Ann and their 3 kids, and Brian and Sarah and cousin Brian and me get to run with Jeff down the street while the crowd is going absolutely insane for this guy that none of them know. Nobody knows who this guy is, but they're just going insane cheering him on. I wanted to give you just a little taste of what that moment was like. The video doesn't do it justice, and it's shaky, and I'm screaming really loud, but here's just a taste of the finish line of the Leadville Trail 100. I don't know if you saw the clock, 29 hours, 44 minutes and 34 seconds after he started, he crosses the finish line. He crosses the finish line. He just like bends over and starts weeping because he's got nothing left. We all start hugging him and jumping and freaking out. And so here's what happened to me in that moment. In that moment, I got a new appreciation for what it is to cheer somebody on towards something they believe in. I got a new appreciation for what is it like when you see somebody who's giving their effort to a massive, to an epic, to a brilliant task. Okay, I know some of you are like, Karl, that's ridiculous, idiotic, insane task. But he and I think it's a wonderful task. I got an appreciation for what it's like to be in that moment, just saying, I am so for you right now. I'm just going to yell and scream and do whatever I can to encourage you along. And I wanted to tell that story because what I think Paul is doing in the letter to the Romans is yelling and screaming and encouraging the Roman Christians along. And I think if he were here today, he would be yelling and screaming and encouraging us to go all in for God. And what we're going to talk about for the rest of these next few minutes is why is it that Paul thinks this God is so worth going all in for? If you're going to go all in, you better go all in for something that's worth it. We're going to hear why Paul thinks it's worth it. So, brief background, then we're just going to walk step by step through the text. We're going to do the first half the verse quick. We're going to camp out on the idea of living sacrifice for a minute. And we're going to wrap it up at the end. So quick background, Paul, he used to imprison, persecute, and kill Christians. Now he's telling the Jesus story and starting churches. And he's writing to the church in Rome. Rome is the capital city of the greatest, most powerful empire in the world at that time. Rome, a place, all of literature describes these wild, lavish parties of the Roman elite. It's a very cosmopolitan city. You know it's a good party if people are reclining at the table, like that guy in the middle. That's how you know it's a good party in Rome. Rome, they had some of the best first stadiums out there, the Colosseum. Okay, it was pretty tragic what happened in the Colosseum, but a beautiful building. Did you know they could flood the Colosseum in order to reenact naval battles for people? They fill it up with water. I read that. I was like, that's incredible. We gotta figure out how to flood Mile High Stadium to do like, boating on it. Anyway, so big city, some very cosmopolitan city, lots of things going on. Also in Rome, lots of gods. The Roman pantheon had all sorts of gods. This is a statue of the god Mars, one of the head Roman gods of the time. Another one that you might have heard of, Neptune. The Greek version is Poseidon with their little trident, right? I found one cartoon. Apparently Neptune likes to wag his finger at people. I don't know. I thought that was funny. And I noticed it's from mygodpictures.com. So, if you're looking for something fun to do, go look at mygodpictures.com. There's another one. I was like, is that Little Mermaid? Is that King Trident from The Little Mermaid? That's what I thought. They have the whole Roman god family tree. And this is all to say that Rome was not just cosmopolitan, big, social elites in the city of Rome, but it was also a polytheistic city. There were lots of different gods on offer for the people in the city of Rome. And not just the Roman gods, but every nation that Rome conquered, and Rome conquered a lot of nations. Every nation that Rome conquered, that nation's religion kind of got folded into this smorgasbord of Roman religions available. So Paul is writing to a city that has dozens of different gods that one might worship. And so inherent behind that is the question, Paul, why would we worship your God when there's all these gods out there? If there's all these things we can give our lives, give our hearts, give our time, give our money to, why would we give it to your God instead of the others? And Paul's trying to encourage the Christians to say, I'll tell you why following Jesus is different than any other God you could follow. Second thing going on, the Roman church was an interesting blend of both Jewish and Gentile Christians. The Roman church was full of ethnic and societal diversity. People were coming together across cultural lines, linguistic barriers, ethnic lines, and Paul was making the argument, one of the reasons, or rather one of the results of worshiping this God who's so worth worshiping is that it brings together people who are otherwise divided. Fortunately, in America, we have no division today, so that is an irrelevant message for us. So you can just ignore that part of Paul's story. So here we go. That's the background. Polytheistic, the potential of division in the church, and Paul is making the argument, why would I worship this God? Paul's going to tell us why. First word, therefore. Simple word that gives us a significant clue. What Paul is about to say only makes sense if we have first understood Romans chapter 1 through 11, which is Paul's presentation and explanation of the gospel. Paul just spent 11 chapters saying, what is the good news of God? Why is it that we think God has brought news to us which is good? Good for our lives, good for our communities, good for our cities, good in every way. Paul just got done saying that. And what he's about to say is the result, the logical implications of this good news. So if we don't start with the good news, if that's not present in our lives, then what Paul is about to say isn't going to make sense. In chapter 12, Paul begins explaining, no longer explaining the gospel, but explaining the logical response to the gospel. What Paul is going to do is he's going to say, if you comprehend the good news of God, this is how the response looks in your life. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters. I love that word urge. The Greek word is parakaleo. I wrote it in italics in your notes if you want. I want to read you another place in the New Testament that the word parakaleo is used. It's the Gospel of John, chapter 14, starting in verse 15. This is the words of Jesus. Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commands, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. So Jesus is talking about the Holy Spirit, this idea that God's great, good, merciful presence is spiritually with everybody at all times and in all places, and that Spirit, Jesus promises, will be with us. And what word does Jesus use to describe that Spirit? He calls it an advocate. And what's the Greek word for advocate here? Parakaleo. So when Paul says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, it's not a, you better get in line and I'm really telling you what to do. It's a, I am with you. I am advocating for you. I just ran with you overnight and I am cheering like crazy to get you across the finish line. I believe in this so much that I am going to be with you in this. Paul is not calling us to do something that he himself won't do, but rather he's calling us to do something that he is with us in. And I think Paul is a constant encourager, and I think it's such a beautiful challenge to us as we consider in our own lives how we've encountered the gospel and how that's caused a response in our lives and kind of led to our lived lives. How beautiful is it to be reminded that we can encourage one another in this journey? Paul's writings are full of encouragement. That is such a good reminder. When he writes to the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians, he says, I always thank my God for you. Wouldn't that be an encouraging thing to hear? Somebody came up to you and like, hey man, every time I think of you, I thank my God for you. That is such an encouraging thing to hear. In his letter to the Galatians, and actually in a bunch of his letters, Paul starts out with his letter. He says, grace and peace to you. Wouldn't that be a great thing to just like speak into one another's lives? Hey, grace and peace into your life. Just, oh man, grace and peace into your life. He wrote to a church in Philippi. He said, I always pray for you with joy because of our partnership in the gospel. How encouraging would it be to hear somebody say, man, every time I pray for you, every time I think of you and I'm praying for you, I'm just filled with joy because I love seeing what God's doing in your life. May we be people, as we continue to consider God's words, as we continue to consider the God we serve, may we be people who relentlessly encourage one another in this continuing of faith, just like Paul did. So, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy. Paul's about to get to his challenge, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. He's about to get to living sacrifices, but the only way we can really get there is if we get there with God's mercy in view. If we're going to respond to God, Paul believes we must respond to an encounter with God's mercy. And I think that's critical because in my experience, a fair number of people in the world today who don't like God, who don't like church, who don't like Jesus, people that I encounter who say things like, man, I just want nothing to do with religion or with Christianity. If you follow up with them and ask them, yeah, tell me more about that. Why not? I've heard things like, well, you know what? I see the hateful, violent things that Christians do, and I want nothing to do with that God. Good. I don't want anything to do with that God either. Oh, yeah, but last time I was in a church, I was condemned, like the people on the screen, right? People come out and they say, I'm gay and I don't know what to do with that. And they go to a church and they're told, you know what, you can leave now because you're not wanted here. People reject that God, and I reject that God too, because what Paul is talking about is a God whom you encounter with unfathomable mercy and grace. That's exactly what Paul talks about for the whole chapter before this verse. Chapter 11, verse 25, Paul says, he's talking about God's mercy. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery. The mercy of God is so great, it's so good that Paul has to land on, it's a mystery. If you think you understand it, you haven't fully understood it. If you think you fully grasp it, you haven't fully grasped it. Because if it's the mercy of God, it is by definition greater than what we can grasp. If I think to myself, okay, this is what mercy is. I think I get it. I think I understand it. This must be God's mercy. If I can fully understand it, it's definitely not the mercy of God, because God's mercy must be greater and beyond what I can understand. I can maybe understand a piece of it. I can maybe catch a glimpse of it. I can maybe understand just a little glimmer of it, but the fullness of it is so far beyond what we can comprehend. When we encounter that which was beyond our comprehension, that's what causes a response. Paul tries to capture it. He writes this poem, this song, as he's reflecting on how unbelievably great the gospel is. He says, oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. So this response that Paul's going to call us to is only a valid response if it's a response to an encounter with God's mercy. And so what is that response? Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, when you see God's mercy, you encounter it, and you're about to respond to it, how to respond? In view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. I want to really dive into this phrase, living sacrifice. Everybody say, living sacrifice. Sacrifice, you guys sounded half-hearted about that, but that's okay. This is good. Sacrifice was a very common, extensively practiced feature of religion throughout Rome and actually throughout history. So to grasp the impact of Paul's words, living sacrifice, I want to give you a brief tour of the history of sacrifice in religion. So one of the very oldest religious texts that we have today is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Comes from ancient Samaria. And in this story, if you haven't read it, go Google it. You can get a full copy online. It's great. Penguin Books version is great. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the king, Gilgamesh, is one very arrogant. He's very, very self-centered and likes to point out how great he is over and over and over again. In his arrogance, Gilgamesh says, I'm going to go fight the beast Marduk, which for all of you Disney fans out there, the movie Brave, right? The devil bear in Brave is named Marduk. Yeah, from Gilgamesh. Well done, Disney. So Gilgamesh is going to go fight Marduk. And what does he do? He does the normal thing you do when you're going to pick a fight with a beast. He goes and gets his mom. And he takes his mom. Right, that's what you do. I'm going to go pick a fight. Mom. I would go, Arlene, I'm going to go pick a fight. Come with me. he gets his mom and brings her to the temple of the main god at that time, a god named Shamash. And Gilgamesh and his mom offer sacrifices to Shamash. They offer fragrant cuttings. I don't know what a fragrant cutting is, but apparently they think Shamash would like it. They offer ritual words and ritual actions, and they might also offer a pendant. The text is a little confused. We've lost dozens of lines from the text, so we have to guess. But they might even offer a pendant, something valuable to the god. And Gilgamesh says, I offer these things to Shamash so that Shamash might give me his favor in my fight with Marduk. So from the very beginning of religious history, sacrifice was commonly practiced to win the favor of the gods. It's almost like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go and buy some god power so I can bring it with me in what I'm doing. I'm going to bring it with me in this big fight, or maybe I'm just a farmer and I want to grow some wheat so my children don't die, so I'm going to sacrifice to the gods to buy their favor so my wheat grows. We see this practice throughout religious history. We see this practice throughout the Roman Empire in which Paul is writing. And when we think about sacrifice this way, there's some really unsettling conclusions that people can come to. See, if I have to sacrifice something to win the God's favor, then I could start by just offering a fragrant cutting. But if I really want the God's favor, then maybe I'm going to offer something more valuable. Maybe I'm going to sacrifice an animal that I've raised, and that's pretty precious to me. Or maybe if I really, really want the God's favor, I'm going to sacrifice my very best animal, or maybe multiple animals. And then religion can take a really scary twist. The Sumerian religion from the Epic of Gilgamesh, religions in Rome at the time of Paul's writing, taken to the logical conclusion, if I really want God's favor, I'll sacrifice my own child for that God. Archaeologists find evidence from ancient Samaria, from ancient Rome, from many cultures that people will kill their own children to win God's favor. We see this evidenced in the Bible, in the prophet Micah. He's writing and he's having this dialogue with God, and he's saying to God, what are we supposed to do to have a right relationship with you, God? And Micah talks about the ways that he sees other cultures winning the favor of God. Micah says, Micah chapter 6, verse 6, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings? Should I give him some grain or some of my crop? Shall I come before him with calves a year old? Should I sacrifice one of my animals? Will that make God's favor? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams? If not one animal, what about thousands of animals? Will the Lord be pleased with 10,000 rivers of oil? What if I give God all my wealth? Then can I buy God's favor? The scripture is very familiar with religions that say if you want God's favor, you need to buy it from God. And then he continues, will the Lord be pleased with the offering of my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? I think when Paul is writing to the Romans and talks about sacrifice, it would have been understood that for many, if not most, if not maybe all other religions offered up at the time, if you want, or when you offer a sacrifice, you're offering it to win the favor of the gods in your life. But what does Micah say in response to this? This beautiful passage, should I offer a burnt offering or one animal or 1,000 animals or even my firstborn son? God has shown all you people what is good. God's already told you what to offer. He's already shown you what is good. Is it animals? Is it crops? Is it wealth? Is it your own kids? What does the Lord require of you, the prophet says? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. To act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Wait a minute. Act, love, and walk. Those are hard things to do when you're dead. They demand somebody who is alive. And Paul follows up with this verse from Micah. We see it again in the prophet Isaiah chapter 58. We see it all the way back to the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22, where God calls Abraham, hey, Abraham, sacrifice your child to me. And Abraham's about to do it, and God says, stop, don't do it. You don't have to sacrifice your child. And we read Genesis 22, we're like, God would ask Abraham to offer the child? But the first readers, the point's not that God asked. The point is the first readers go, wait a minute. This God doesn't want you to sacrifice your child? No, because according to Paul, this God has a radically different understanding of sacrifice. God is not interested in death. He's interested in life. God is not interested in you killing in order to get some weird favor purchase. God is interested in you living. Life is the purpose and the desire of this God that Paul is talking about. And that stands in stark and radical contrast to so many other systems in the world, whether they're religious systems in the past or even systems of power and religion in our day that demand some perverted form of death in order to get power. And Paul says, no, what this God wants is that we live our lives. And when we do that, when we encounter the mercy of God and we respond by offering not death, not some strange purchasing of God's favor, but rather the free giving of our life, the text says, this is holy and pleasing to God. It is true worship. That phrase, true worship, I love it. Logike latreia. The first word, logike, it's the same word we get logic from. It's the reasonable thing to do. And latreia just means worship or service or way of responding to the gods. And one translation I really liked said, this is our logical liturgy. When you actually encounter God's mercy, when you hear the good news of God, that you cannot buy God's favor, there's nothing you can do to make God love you more. All you can do is encounter God's mercy and respond with love. The only reasonable thing to do is say, wow, I want to give my life to that. I think we're familiar with this idea that when we encounter something stunningly, brilliantly, beautiful, compelling, good, and we say, man, that's what God looks like, you just can't help but be moved to respond. And so I want to end with a story that captures what I think that's like lived out in our life. I got this story from Brian Haytek. Brian, you get two stories this morning, Brian Haytek, and actually from his brother-in-law. I don't know if you know, so Brian's sister, Christy, actually passed away just a couple months ago. She had been battling cancer for over 10 years and passed away just at the end of the summer. And Brian, we continue to mourn with you. So Christy's husband told Brian this story, who told me this story. Christy and Brian grew up in Bakersfield, California. Christy still lived there. And I don't know much about Bakersfield, only what I've heard from Brian. But apparently also in Bakersfield, California, there's a family, the family of David Karl. Now, I'd never heard of David Karl, but I guess if you follow pro football, he's a football player. Okay, I've got a few nods. Good for you football fans. I was told he played for the Texans. Is that a football team? The Texans? So David Karl lives in Bakersfield, California, and he's got a lot of money, and from what I can tell, somebody as wealthy and famous as David Karl, that's not the norm of Bakersfield. I've been told Bakersfield is not a mecca for wealthy, kind of high-class individuals. Well, the hospital in Bakersfield was renovating their hospital, and the David Karl family comes to the hospital and says, hey, we want to pay for all of the furnishings, all of the everything for one of the floors of this hospital. Just like what, you just tell us the dollar amount, right? All the beds, all the receptionist desks and chairs and everything. You just tell us the dollar amount. We want to pay it, we'll write you the check. And the hospital says, wow, thank you. That's great. Karl family says, we'd like, if it's okay, on that floor, once it's complete, we'd just like to have a plaque, with the name of our family foundation on it. And the hospital says, yeah, of course. And then they say, and actually also on this plaque, we'd like to, what we want to do is reach out to the community and ask for names of people from the community who have just been making an impact, who have been doing good, who have been positively influencing the community of Bakersfield. And the hospital says, of course, that's brilliant. So they start taking submissions from the community of names of people to put on this plaque in the hospital wing. And the committee gets a letter from a student at Stockdale High School, a local high school in that area. And the student tells this story. She says, my freshman year at Stockdale High School, my locker was just outside the classroom of this math teacher. And not too long into my freshman year, I noticed that this math teacher in the mornings, she's calling a couple students sometimes into her classroom before school starts. And the teacher is just like encouraging these students, checking in on them. And before too long, the student, writing the letter, finds herself in the classroom of this math teacher. And the math teacher would do things like bring instant oatmeal and make oatmeal and feed the students and say things like, a hungry learner is not a prepared learner, and I want you guys to be prepared for the day. And this teacher was just encouraging them through the ups and downs of high school life, and this student is now in college and finds herself looking towards the end of college and saying, where's my life going? And so she writes to the Karl Family Foundation and says, I'm in college, and I want my life to make a difference, like my math teacher, Christy Haytack Gross, Brian's sister, whose name is now on a plaque at the hospital in Bakersfield. Brian told me this story, and I loved it for a lot of reasons. First, I loved it because there's something awesome when, so doing the right thing is not all about recognition, but when somebody gets recognized who deserves to be recognized, her name is just meant to be on that plaque. And when you see that happen, you just think, man, that's good. The second thing I like about it is this student who recommended Christy, from the way I'm doing the math, this student's in college, which means this student knew Christy over the last 6 to maybe 8 years of her life, which means this student knew Christy while she was battling cancer. Christy's cancer came back 5 times in the 10 years. And when I think about that, I think, man, it would have been perfectly reasonable if Christy said, I'm kind of out of energy. I don't have any extra to give. I don't have what it takes to feed oatmeal to a student in the morning before class. That would be perfectly reasonable, but that's not what she did. She called the kids in. She encouraged them. She checked up on them. It's an unbelievable example of the mercy of God encountered in somebody's life and resulting in her being a living sacrifice for others. The last thing I love about Christy's story is we live in a world infected by the desire for big, multinational, millions of people, huge, splashy, flashy impact. And what Christy did was she said, I've got a couple students whose lockers are right outside my door, and I can make a difference for them. And she did, and the impact reverberates over and over. Pretty much every time Brian talks about his sister, he says to me, she just makes me want to be a better teacher. Now here's the thing, Brian's an unbelievable teacher, but when he sees his sister living this way, he can't help but be moved to respond. When her student saw Christy live, the student said, I can't help but respond. And this is what Paul is calling to us today. When we actually grasp the unfathomable beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the goodness of a God who doesn't ask us to buy his favor, but gives it to us freely, when we encounter the goodness of that God, the natural response is to be a living sacrifice. So what do we do? 3 brief thoughts for how do we respond. 1, if you're going to be a living sacrifice, that means you got to live. You got to actually be alive. And I think it's far too common for people to walk around with a little bit of deadness inside of them, but to cover it up, to pretend, to hide it, to push it down, to say, I don't want to acknowledge the little piece of death that's inside of me. I'd rather just cover it up. But if we're going to respond to the God of mercy who asks us to be living sacrifices, we have to live fully alive. So if you're sitting here this morning and you're like, I don't know, part of me is just dead, I'd ask you not to be okay with that. Don't be okay with that. Talk to somebody about it. Talk to a friend, talk to a spouse, talk to a counselor, talk to somebody so that you can start the journey of living fully alive. One resource I've come across recently, it's called the Enneagram. It's all over the place. Tons of people write about it, but there's some profound resources out there that take the Enneagram and say, this is what you look like fully alive, so here's some ideas for spiritual practice to help you be fully alive. I'll link some books in the next All Church email. Live. Second, I think Christy was a story of somebody who lived fully alive, even in the midst of some brutal struggles. And one of the ways that fully alive people always live is by giving to others. I don't know if it's one of the opportunities that we have at church. I don't know if it's something in your everyday life, but how is God prompting you with the life you've been given to give to someone else? And last but not least, we're a community of people seeking to encounter God's mercy and respond by being living sacrifices. Let's be people who go absolutely insane, advocating for, cheering, screaming, yelling, supporting, bringing one another on to the finish line. Because I tell you what, it's gonna be hard. You're gonna feel kind of like Jeff did at mile 99, where every ounce of energy is drained from your body, but when you've got a group of people around you, whose arms are around you, believing in you, cheering you along the way, we will make it further in the journey. Let's pray. God, considering Paul's words and considering the story after story after story of people throughout the ages who have encountered the good news of Jesus Christ, that we cannot buy God's favor, but it's been freely given, and when we encounter that, it overwhelms us and calls us to a response. As people on that journey, help us to always come back to an encounter with you, and when we do, to give our lives as a sacrifice worthy of your good news. We pray this in your name. Amen.